ustedes James Robinson.
Gracias. Gracias. Buenos días a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Es un honor y un gusto para mí. Pero desafortunadamente voy a hablar en inglés. Entonces, okay. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and in general, but mostly talking about the Americas, Latin America. Then I'll talk a little bit about Chile. I don't feel I'm an expert on Chile, and especially compared to the Minister of Hacienda, I'm definitely not an expert, but I'll say a little bit about some of the challenges in Chile from the perspective of our book. Okay, so why nations fail? What's the book about? And I always think if you can understand what the book is about just by looking at one photograph, here it is, okay? And this photograph is the Korean peninsula at night. And, you know, what can you see? Well, you can see that South Korea is very bright. There's a lot of electricity, a lot of light bulbs, and North Korea is very black. There's a little bit of light here. Maybe the presidential compound in Pyongyang. The past president used to have a big wave machine, and you need a lot of electricity to run a wave machine. So this picture reflects many things. It reflects, of course, very large differences in technology. Okay, I'm going to talk about technology. It's not a very old technology, electricity or the light bulb. It goes back to the 19th century. But obviously it has enormous consequences for people's lives, for industry, for productivity. It's difficult to do your schoolwork at night if you don't have light to read your books by. So this has enormous consequences for society, for economic development, people's welfare. Okay? Enormous differences in living standards. Life expectancy is about 10 years higher in South Korea than it is in North Korea. And of course, in North Korea, when you leave school, you have to go into the military for 10 years. So there's enormous differences in economic development between these societies. But this is particularly interesting for a social scientist because of this dramatic discontinuity. There's nothing fundamentally different about North and South Korea. The people are the same, the language is the same, the history is the same, the culture is the same, the geography is the same. But the difference is in the completely different way that these two societies got organized in the 1940s and 1950s. South Korea was organized in a way which created incentives and opportunities for its people. And North Korea was organized in a way which destroyed incentives and opportunities for the vast mass of people, except maybe the ones connected with elites in the Communist Party. Okay? So my book it's not a book about the difference between capitalism and socialism. You may look at this picture and say, oh, well, we know what the answer is. The South Korea has capitalism and North Korea has socialism. But that's not the story we tell. As the discussion goes on, you'll see that, well, it's not really a discussion, it's more like a monologue. But anyway, as the speech goes on, you'll see that this is just examples of something much more general. Okay? But this picture is very interesting because it allows us as social scientists to discriminate between lots of different competing explanations for economic success and economic failure. But I want you to take away, the first thing to take away is that what's going on here is kind of intuitive, enormous differences in incentives and opportunities in South Korea, and that's what creates prosperity, innovation, entrepreneurship, the adoption and use of technology. Okay? So in the start of the picture, we use a different picture, which is the border between United States on the right-hand side and Mexico on the left-hand side. So this is Nogales. And here you see the fence. President Trump didn't build this fence. It was there It was there already. It's been there for quite a long time. But maybe he'll make it sort of bigger and more glamorous. But anyway, there's a fence. And this, like the difference between North Korea and South Korea, is meant to sort of drive home this point that you have these enormous differences in prosperity right next to each other. And it's hard to understand them in terms anything other than what social scientists would call institutional differences, what the president was discussing this morning, the president of the Camera was discussing this morning. Differences in the rules in society that influence people's incentives and opportunities. Okay? Those rules are very different in the United States than they are in Mexico, and that's created very different historical patterns of investment, innovation, and prosperity. Okay? So to delve more into what that means, let me not compare two countries, but two people. Okay? So this is a little bit controversial, but I think once you get the idea, this tells you an awful lot about the difference between Latin America and North America, and also between poor countries and rich countries in the world. Okay? So, here's Bill Gates. Okay? So what I want you to think about is to think about the two, well, they used to be the two richest men in the world when we were writing this book. They're not the two richest men in the world anymore, but they're up there. Okay? Bill Gates is a very wealthy man. How did he make his money? He made his money through innovation. Okay? The Minister of Hacienda mentioned total factor productivity and the importance of productivity growth. Okay? Economists have known since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s that what drives economic development, what drives improvements in living standards is innovation, productivity. You go back to the British Industrial Revolution. What was the British Industrial Revolution? It was innovation. It was the invention of the steam engine. It was the mechanization of production, the factory system, railway. It was about innovation, ways of increasing human productivity, what people can do and produce. Okay? That's what Bill Gates did. Bill Gates innovated in the software industry. He became extremely wealthy, but he generated much, much more wealth than accrued to him. He pulled thousands and thousands of talented people into the industry. His ideas created all sorts of externalities and spillovers, which made that industry one of the driving forces in the US economy or the world economy. Okay? So, yes, he became very rich, but he created enormous wealth for everybody. But we are, in the first chapter of the book, we compare the way he made his fortune to the way Carlos Slim made his fortune. Carlos Slim made his fortune. He's also a very talented, brilliant businessman, but he made his fortune not by innovating, but by getting the Mexican telecom monopoly privatized to himself. So the OECD made a calculation that the losses to the Mexican economy from the telecom monopoly were twice Carlos Slim's own fortune just between the years 2005 and 2009. So this isn't just taking money from Mexicans and giving it to Carlos Slim. This is making the whole country poorer. That's exactly the opposite of what Bill Gates did. Okay? Now, this is not a story about heroic innovator, good guy, bad guy. This photo is chosen very carefully. What's Bill Gates doing here? He's swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Why is he doing that? He's in front of US antitrust authorities. Okay? Bill Gates wanted to be a monopolist too, just like Carlos Slim. It's just more difficult to get away with it in the United States. Everybody wants to be a monopolist, even academics. Academics want to be intellectual monopolists. It's just more competition. There's a lot of competition in academia. So this is a very interesting photograph, and it's not a new phenomenon in the United States. Here's an old example of it. What's this? It's an octopus, but it's got a rather funny head. You see it's got a sort of oil drum. It's got Standard Oil written on its head. So this is the Standard Oil cartel, if you like, that was created by Rockefeller in the 19th century. And you can see it's got its tentacles around oil wells, but it's also got its tentacles around the White House, around Congress, around... The Standard Oil Company was very involved in politics and friends with politicians, and what happened to the Standard Oil Company? It was broken up by US antitrust authorities earlier in the 19th century. So the fight against monopoly goes back a long way in the United States. Okay? So two very talented men, two great entrepreneurs, put their energies in very different directions. Bill Gates put his energy into innovation. Why did he do that? Because of the institutions, because the patterns of institutions created the incentives to innovate and the opportunities to innovate, to get capital, to start a business. That's what Bill Gates did. In Mexico, the institutions push people's talents in different directions, not in the direction which is beneficial for the society, but in a different direction. Okay? And that explains a lot about why the United States is much richer than Mexico is. So in the book, we use a word which I was very happy to hear both the president of the Cámara and the minister Larraín mention, which was inclusive. So we introduced some terminology. What was it about these institutions that Bill Gates faced? What was it about these institutions that Carlos Slim faced? Well, we call the institutions that Bill Gates faced inclusive institutions. Okay? So the way to think about inclusive institutions is they're institutions that create broad-based incentives and opportunities for people in society. What about in Mexico? Well, we call those extractive institutions. Okay? Inclusive and extractive. Now, this word inclusive, it's a very significant word, and let me illustrate it with another picture. Before I do that, you probably all know what this is. So this is the plan for the new airport in Mexico City. So I won't elaborate on that remark, but I'm sure you all know who designed it and who's building it. Okay, so, whoops. So here's a light bulb. It's a patent for the light bulb, okay? I started by talking about light bulbs in Korea. Here's Thomas Edison's patent. So Thomas Edison, one of the world's great innovators, he invented the light bulb, and he took out a patent in 1880. Okay? This hasn't got to North Korea yet, but there it is. Now, a patent, it's a very interesting thing. Patents are so important, they're in the US Constitution. And the first patent board that sat in 1790 was considered to be so important that Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, actually sat on the patent board. So somebody as important as Thomas Jefferson sat there deciding whether to give patents to people's innovation. Okay? So the patents are, what does that do? It creates incentives. It creates incentives. It gives you intellectual property rights to create incentives to innovate. Why do you need something like a patent? Well, because when you have an idea, when you have an innovation, then that's something that spreads to everybody. Other people borrow your ideas, other people can build on your innovation. So you create a lot more wealth for society than you yourself can exploit. So there's a misalignment between what's good for an individual, what's good for society. The patent is supposed to reduce that misalignment, to bring private and social incentives together. Okay? So the patent creates incentives. But there's something interesting about the patent and the patent board in the United States, which is that the patent system was open to everybody. You could all pay the same fee, the government give you a patent, and the government would protect your intellectual property rights. And if you look at who was it that patented, who was Thomas Edison? Was he some elite or, his father was a roofing contractor, he was homeschooled. I'm not advocating homeschooling, but just to point out, he was a very modest person from a modest background, but he was somebody with a huge amount of energy and talent and creativity. If you look at who it was that filed these patents in the United States in the 19th century, when it was becoming the world's most successful and dynamic economy, and you ask, where did these people come from? What you see is they come from all over the social spectrum. Elites, non-elites, farmers, artisans, professional people. Talent, ideas, creativity, entrepreneurship, that's everywhere in society. You don't know where that is. The Minister of Hacienda doesn't know where that is. The President doesn't know where it is. So to be successful, to be economically dynamic, you have to create a set of institutions that just allows your society to tap into all of that latent talent, to give people incentives, to give people opportunities. That's where innovation comes from. That's where prosperity comes from. And that's what the United States did, albeit imperfectly, in the last 200 years. Okay, so this dichotomy between inclusive institutions and extractive institutions, it's very simplistic. There's lots of shades of gray in reality, and I'm more than happy to talk about that. You know, academics love talking about subtle nuances and shades of gray, but I think it's just the dichotomy is useful for developing the argument. Okay, so think of this distinction between inclusive and extractive institutions. Where does that come from? Why is it that some countries have inclusive economic institutions and other countries have extractive economic institutions? Is that just that some countries have better economic advisors than others? Or some went to Harvard and some went to Chicago and some went to Yale and, you know, they have different ideas. And that's not the story in the book. Go back to North Korea versus South Korea. That's sort of obvious what the difference is, right? It's about politics. South Korea didn't get organized differently from North Korea because they had different economists, probably true. But the story in North Korea is politics, it's political institutions, okay? So we say in the book, lying behind these extractive economic institutions that block incentives and opportunities, there's a particular type of politics. There's extractive political institutions, okay? And what you need to create inclusive economic institutions is inclusive politics. It's not a coincidence that the United States started this patent board and had this inclusive system of patenting. It did it for two reasons. One, it had a government, it had a state which was capable of actually enforcing the patent system. So that's important. Think about Standard Oil Company or Bill Gates. Many Latin American countries have very nice antitrust laws. I know the people who wrote them. But they're very, very difficult to enforce in Latin America, okay? So that scene of Bill Gates appearing, telling to swear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is a scene that's very difficult to imagine in most Latin American countries, okay? So it's about the state and the capability of the state, what social scientists would call the capacity of the state, okay? But of course, it's also how political power is spread in society. Okay? The reason that you had such an inclusive system of patents in the United States had a lot to do with the fact that, you know, by world historical standards, this was a very democratic society at the time. So this was a society where at least white males were enfranchised. So rather sexist society, but it was a situation where political power was sufficiently broadly distributed in society that it was impossible to have some oligarchized patent system. You had to make the system open for people, okay? So behind the economics, behind extractive economics, behind inclusive economics, lies politics. I think that's very clear in the Korean case. It's pretty clear if you think about the history of Mexico and the United States as well. It's not so recently that they had a one-party state in Mexico, and it's also obvious that the Mexican state itself struggles desperately to undertake basic functions that the state is supposed to do, providing public goods, order, security for its citizens. So behind extractive economic institutions or extractive political institutions, behind inclusive economic institutions are inclusive political institutions. You know, here's my favorite example of extractive political institutions. This is President Mugabe, who until last year, for 37 years, was the president of Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. Now, you know perhaps President Mugabe as a very successful politician, but what you didn't know, he was also a terribly lucky man, okay? So here he is, he used to win the lottery. How about that? You know, did Chile have politicians like that? I doubt it, you know, and that's a good thing, okay? So here he is, it's on the BBC. Mr. Mugabe's name was drawn from thousands of customers, I bet it was, yes. Okay, so you know, this is a country which has suffered terribly from extractive political institutions since independence, from extractive economic institutions, enormous insecurity of property rights, and as a consequence, has a level of income per capita which is about half of what it was in 1980. Okay? So the extractive political institutions has created an extractive economic institutions. I did some research in Zimbabwe last year for the World Bank and on the prospects for economic growth. And I met with a very interesting Egyptian lady who was a business person. And I was trying to understand the incentives and the problems and the challenges in Zimbabwe. And at some moment she looked at me and said, I don't know what you think is so puzzling. There's plenty of money in this country for 300 people. Okay, so what's the role of construction in all of this? Absolutely critical. I talked at the start about the British Industrial Revolution, about innovation. What happened before the British Industrial Revolution happened? A transportation revolution happened. That's what happened. An infrastructural revolution, okay? So here's some very boring maps, but this is the spread of the canal system, okay? So you can see that at the start of the 18th century, there were hardly any canals. The canals spread. Whoops, sorry. By 1830, at the flourishing of the Industrial Revolution, entrepreneurs, private sector, had built a national system of canals that allowed all the new manufacturing centers in Yorkshire, in the Midlands, in Lancashire, to very cheaply export all of these things that the Industrial Revolution was producing. And not just canals, roads. 1720, before the Industrial Revolution happens. Where's the road system? Hardly there. What happens in 1740? Roads spread. 1770, when the Industrial Revolution takes off. Entrepreneurs had created a national network of roads, okay? So the infrastructure was incredibly important for providing the foundation of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And what happened to innovation? I mentioned patents. Here's what happened, okay? 1770, just around the time when this national system of canals and roads is being constructed by the private sector, what happens to innovation? It rockets, okay? Patenting rockets. This is the Industrial Revolution. This is James Watt, Matthew Boulton patenting their steam engine, okay? So infrastructure is crucial for innovation, it's crucial for industrialization, it's crucial for prosperity, it's crucial for people's welfare. I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and one of my African friends in Sierra Leone, he always says, you know what the most important thing for somebody's welfare in this country is? What's the most important transition for your welfare? It's when you go from living in a house with a dirt floor to having a concrete floor and a proper roof instead of branches and leaves. That's kind of, I don't know, maybe that's a bit unimaginable in Chile because you've moved so far beyond that. But can you imagine the change in your life in the rainy season from having a concrete floor instead of a dirt floor? Construction is just, we don't think about that as economists, but it's absolutely critical for people's life, not just their lives, their health, their children's health, everything, okay? So this is not just about patenting and development. It's fundamental in terms of people's welfare, it seems to me, okay? So what about the cross-national evidence on this, okay? Here's the level of infrastructure from the World Bank. What do you see? Well, you pat yourself on the back, Chile. We know you have the highest GDP per capita, but you're also, according to the World Bank, very good in terms of the quality of infrastructure. So this is an index capturing roads and ports and different types of facilities, okay? But you can see this is very strongly correlated. Places like Bolivia or Honduras, which have very poor infrastructure, are also poor countries. Okay? Just look at something as simple as share of paved roads in the country. Again, you see a very positive correlation. Bolivia, Nicaragua, Honduras, they have very low shares of roads which are surfaced. They're relatively poor. Okay, so there's very strong correlations cross-nationally. This is just looking at Latin America. I could do this for the whole world, but I'm just doing it for Latin America here, showing this connection between infrastructure and investment in infrastructure and prosperity. And what I've been trying to suggest is the evidence is consistent with a connection to much more fundamental things in society also. Okay, so I made some maps here because nowadays we have nice technology. I'm not going to go into that in detail. This is digital maps of shared paved roads in different parts of the country. And let me just, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but let me just give you one example to contrast to Colombia. Okay? So think about what's the difference between Colombia and Chile. I'd say that has everything to do with the fact that Colombia has much more extractive institutions than Chile does. Okay? Colombia has a state which is much less effective at doing anything. It has terrible roads. In fact, you can see here the Pacific coast, which is booming everywhere in Latin America, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile. You can't even get to the Pacific coast in Colombia. There's hardly a road there. You know, there's a road here to Buenaventura. There's a road to Buenaventura, but it took the Colombians 150 years to build that road, okay? And it's still in pretty awful condition. So the whole Pacific littoral here, you can't even get there. How can you have economic development when there isn't even a road there? How could you have... There's just enormous problems with the road system in Colombia, okay? You contrast that to Chile, you see in the Chilean case, there's just a much more consistent grid and network of roads. In Colombia, there's just enormous holes. There's numerous departmental capitals that aren't even connected to the rest of Colombia by a road. And I don't think that matters. That doesn't matter just for productivity and innovation and welfare that we've been talking about. It also matters for what sort of society you want to have, okay? For having a national identity and some sense of a common purpose and a common vision. You know, if you have people so isolated they're not even connected to the rest of the country by roads, then that creates a very different type of social dynamic and much more difficult context in which to develop a national plan or develop a consensus or mediate disputes, okay? So I think the large differences you see in development within Latin America correspond to differences in infrastructure, differences in institutions, differences in policy. So this is a policy index from the Inter-American Development Bank, which is a kind of aggregate of different ways of measuring policy, the adaptability of policy, the stability of policy, the efficiency of policy, okay? You can see here something that the Minister of Hacienda was sort of emphasizing that Chile does very well in these institutional scores. So if you look historically at Chile, I don't know about the deterioration he was emphasizing, but this is just looking at an average over about the past 15 years. You see Chile ranks persistently much better, okay? But one thing to keep in mind is that our view of thinking about the world and economic development is that you shouldn't compare yourself. You know, Chileans shouldn't think, oh, you know, we're doing well because we're doing so much better than the Venezuelans. Okay? So that's true, but in our view, there's no reason that Latin American countries don't have the same level of prosperity as North America, except that they have this history of much more extractive institutions. So if you could transform your institutions, there's no reason why Chile wouldn't have the same living standards or level of prosperity of any country in the world. Okay? So from that perspective, you know, it's a bit misleading. You shouldn't be comparing yourself to other Latin American countries. Maybe Chile moved beyond that. But anyway, it's instructive to think about the connection between policies, infrastructure, and prosperity. Okay? Something that the Minister of Hacienda was also mentioning, which I find interesting, related to inclusive and extractive institutions, is just the way the state works. I think that Chilean democracy is much more inclusive than democracy that I know in Colombia or Argentina or other places. And also the state works much better. So you could think about this as it's really trying to measure the extent to which civil servants are recruited and promoted meritocratically as opposed to using political criteria. And again, you see Chile with Costa Rica is right at the top of this. Okay? So that's to say, when I make these comparisons between inclusive and extractive institutions, my sense is that the reason that Chile has become so much more prosperous than most of Latin America is because it's moved further down the road towards building more inclusive institutions, inclusive political institutions, inclusive economic institutions. Okay? So that's the good news. Okay? So what's the bad news? Okay? The bad news is, you know, there's always challenges. Okay? There's always challenges in improving the inclusiveness of a society. And I'm not an expert on Chile. as I've said. So I've studied other parts of Latin America much more, Colombia in particular. But when I think about Chile, or what I know about Chile, here's that there is an element which I would say, I wouldn't call this extractive, it's more a sort of sociological observation, but it does reflect some type of lack of inclusion in society, okay? And what do I mean by that, okay? Well, this is the composition of Chilean exports, okay? I'm worried I'm talking too long. I can't see a clock anywhere. Sorry, I put my phone here. Okay, all right, good. I'll shut up soon. I think I'm more or less on time. Okay, so this is the composition of Chilean exports, okay? There's a lot of copper. There's a lot of copper, you probably know that, okay? Copper alloys, copper. There's some gold and stuff here. Chemicals, wood, pulp, soda, sulfate, frozen fish, fillets, wood, grapes, wine. It's very natural resource based, okay? So one thing to think about, as I'm sure, the Minister of Hacienda has spent many sleepless nights thinking about, is shouldn't we be diversifying? Shouldn't we be diversifying this? How do we diversify this? Well, I'm not sure whether it's necessary to diversify. The first job I had after I finished my PhD was in Australia. I taught at the University of Melbourne, okay? If you looked at the composition of Australian exports, it looks pretty much like this. It's all natural resource based. When was the last time you bought an Australian manufactured good, okay? But here's what the Australians did. In the 19th century, the Australians created one of the world's most egalitarian and democratic societies, okay? They invested enormously in education. Yes, they specialized in mining, but what did they do? They took over the world mining industry. They exported their capital, they exported their expertise. Their vision was, okay, we're good at this. We're good at this, let's invest in it, and we spread all over the world. I work a lot in Africa. In Congo, I've been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo for the last 6 years. You can run into Australian mining engineers, in a restaurant in Kinshasa. I never met a Chilean. I never met anyone from the Antofagasta Copper Company in a restaurant in Kinshasa. So they took their expertise and their comparative advantage. They didn't diversify their economy in some traditional way of, we need to do import substitution, industrialization, and develop this industry, develop that industry. But they developed a vision for how you exploit on a global level this expertise and this human capital, okay? And I see much less of that in the Chilean case. It seems that Chile has somehow been less ambitious or less capable of doing this. And I guess that's why I emphasize a lot this immense investment in education and social mobility in Australia. And here's a slide which the Minister of Hacienda will forgive me, about the composition of the 2010 cabinet of President Piñera. Okay? So what's remarkable about this is the dominance of people with backgrounds in private schools. Okay? So I understand that's about 7% of the population go to these private schools. And it's not just private schools in general. It's very specific private schools. So I don't know where everybody went to school here, but if you break this down, an enormous number of members of the cabinet went to very few schools in Santiago. Okay, so obviously these are very good schools. They have good teachers. There's enormous investment, but they're also schools which are out of the imagination of most people in Chilean society. Okay, and it's not just in the cabinet; it's also in business. So if you look at CEOs of 100 top firms in Chile in 2008, you find the same dominance of these private schools, okay? And if I look at, it's the same schools, okay? Sacred Hearts and the Divine Verb, San Ignacio, it's the same schools, okay? So this is a more sociological, it's almost. I think it's related to what I would call informal institutions in our book. But I think that whatever the reason, there's something here to make more inclusive, okay? If I go all the way back I got the information on President Alessandri, 1958, very similar, okay? In fact, some of the names of some of the schools have changed, but you see the same thing here. So this is not a new thing, it's a very persistent thing in Chilean society. So Chile has made enormous progress in creating inclusive institutions, but there's work to do, and I guess go back to my discussion of Thomas Edison and who took out patents, and you have many advantages in Chile, but I would say there's still a lot of unutilized talent and entrepreneurship and creativity out there. So there's still a project to try to include those people, okay? How do you do that? How do you deepen the inclusion? And what I'd like to see, I guess, in the future, and I would say also, this is not just about, these were all male schools. Now I think there's one that admits women, okay? So there's lots of issues about inclusion, and many of them are connected to gender. So this was an all-male club in 1958. It's not now, so there's another issue about inclusion. So there's still work to do, and I don't want to belittle at all the types of issues that the Minister of Hacienda was emphasizing. That's all really crucial in terms of investment and debt, and without stable macroeconomy, you're never going to achieve anything. But thinking about the long run, thinking about where will Chile be in 20 years, where will it be in 30 years, will it have the same living standards as North America and Canada? Maybe North America maybe the United States will come to meet you somewhere in the middle. But I would say it's this sort of thing that one should think about. What's a creative strategy for dealing with this? What does this fundamentally reflect? And in other ways, how do we deepen inclusion in Chilean society? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.